Hello, comrades, and welcome to our first video on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 2, Consequences of the Revolution. This first video is part of a two-video series on our first topic, Consolidating Power, which covers the period of October 1917 to April 1918. So historian William Chamberlain, here's a quote from historian William Chamberlain: "The holding of power by the Bolsheviks was a far greater achievement than the taking of it." So that tells us that they had quite a lot of work to do. The fight was not over yet. Just because they had taken power doesn't mean that it was smooth sailing from here, as I'm sure you could have guessed. So where we left off, the October Revolution led to the formation of a Soviet government on the 27th of October 1917. 2 days prior, Lenin had proclaimed the Soviet government in power, but yeah, it wasn't until 27th of October that they officially formed the Soviet government. This government was called the Council of People's Commissars, or the Sovnarkom. The Bolsheviks had mass support for their ideal of all power to the Soviets, but workers and soldiers had not favored all power to the Bolsheviks. So the fact that the Bolsheviks held so much power was slightly concerning to some people. So to appease people's concerns, Lenin claimed that the Sovnarkom would only rule until the Constituent Assembly convened in early 1918, and that the proposed November elections would go ahead as planned. If you'll remember, the provisional governments were just basically holding the fort until a Constituent Assembly election, which was due to be held in November before the Bolsheviks took power in October. So Lenin promised that the Constituent Assembly elections would go ahead as planned. So initial challenges for the Sovnarkom. First of all, there were mass strikes by civil servants and ministerial staff. Not everyone was happy that the Bolsheviks had taken power, so many workers, ministerial workers, and civil workers went on strike. State bank employees prevented Sovnarkom officials from accessing any money. You need money to rule, and it wasn't until the 20th of November, so 3 and a bit weeks after the Bolsheviks had taken control, that the Bolsheviks gained access to money with the help of Red Guards. So they used force to be able to access money from the state bank. The Vikzhel, or the Union of Russian Railroad Workers, which was led by Mensheviks and SRs, who, if you remember, had walked out of the conference in which the Bolsheviks proclaimed themselves in power. So the Vikzhel, Union of Russian Railroad Workers, threatened a strike unless the Bolsheviks shared power with other socialist parties, such as the Mensheviks and SRs. Now, it's important to note here that the SRs had split into two factions. There were the right SRs and the left SRs. The left SRs were aligned with the Bolsheviks, and the right SRs were the ones who were causing the railroad workers to strike along with the Mensheviks. Now, when it became clear that Lenin would not compromise on a Bolshevik-Menshevik SR coalition, 5 leading Bolsheviks resigned from the Central Committee in protest. So not all Bolsheviks were in agreement at this stage. Some thought that they should establish a coalition of socialist parties. But Lenin did not compromise, and so some Bolsheviks did resign. Bolsheviks had not considered how they would govern after the revolution. So few Bolsheviks had any political experience. After all, they were revolutionaries, not politicians. And so on Lenin's advice, they were a reactive party instead of a proactive party. They thought, Lenin basically said, let's see what challenges arise, and we will deal with them when they come up. So not a very proactive way to rule. And it's clear from this that they were in a bit too deep. They didn't really understand how to rule, how to govern. Now, the fall of the provisional government also led to a breakdown of law and order. The wine riots or drink pogroms refers to when soldiers basically broke into wine cellars and pubs and bars and things like that, and stole lots of liquor, had drunken rampages, and rioted. So that was one example of a breakdown of law and order. Also, crimes such as looting, robbery, and assault were common, as was murdering members of the bourgeoisie in the street. So there were many crimes taking place after the fall of the provisional government. Also, attacks on symbols or people of privilege were given approval by the Bolsheviks. So this murdering members of the bourgeoisie was sort of not allowed, but it wasn't condoned. It wasn't condoned, but it was close to condoned. It was basically saying that it's okay. We understand why you would want to do that. As Trotsky said, there is nothing immoral in the proletariat finishing off a class that is collapsing. That is its right. So that's quite a strong quote, showing the attitude of leading Bolsheviks on attacks on symbols of people of privilege, the bourgeoisie. Basically, they were given approval. Here is a source showing soldiers committing drink pogroms. This shows the wine riots that I was referring to earlier. Now, the Cheka, in response to the wine riots, as well as striking civil servants and the state bank employees, preventing the Bolsheviks from gaining access to money, Lenin argued that it was necessary to form a political police force to expose these counter-revolutionary and criminal activities. Very similar, if you'll remember, to the Okhrana under the Tsarist regime. So on the 7th of December, 1917, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, Speculation and Sabotage, which is quite a long name, so otherwise known as the Cheka, was founded. It was headed by this fellow here, Felix Dzerzhinsky, otherwise known as Iron Felix. He was a member of the Milrevkom, as well as the head of security for Bolshevik headquarters. So he was a very good man for the job. He was known as Iron Felix because he was considered quite tough. The Cheka was initially only given authority to publish lists of enemies of the people and confiscate ration cards, but these authorities, their authority to do more extreme acts developed as well. So this developed into the powers of arrest, imprisonment, and even execution of so-called counter-revolutionaries. Looking at some of the new decrees that were brought about under Bolshevik rule, there were many changes that took place in the early stages of Bolshevik rule. This quote from Lenin says, "Yes, we shall destroy everything, and on the ruins we shall build our temple." Basically, we're going to tear the whole system down and then build it back up. Now, this shouldn't be taken literally. They actually protected historical buildings. They valued art and literature and architecture, and so they didn't want to tear down old symbols of the Tsarist regime or buildings that were around during the Tsarist regime. This was just meant metaphorically or figuratively, tearing down the old systems and building up their own. So the first two decrees were the decree on land and the decree on peace. They were on the 26th of October, 1917, and the decree on land gave peasants the right to seize land of the gentry and redistribute it among the peasants. The decree on peace was a promise to negotiate a peace deal. Obviously, they couldn't just announce that they had peace. They needed to negotiate a peace deal with Germany. Also, we had the decree on hours of work, which guaranteed workers an 8-hour working day. The Workers' Control Decree, which gave industrial laborers the right to apply to the government to form self-managing committees in their factories. The Declaration on the Rights of the Peoples of Russia, which was a decree promising the right to national self-determination to various ethnic minorities, unless countries had regimes hostile to the Bolsheviks. So countries such as Ukraine were given the right to independence as long as they had socialist regimes. Now, some other changes included, after organizing an anti-Bolshevik protest of 50,000, the Bolsheviks banned the Cadet Party. So the Cadet Party, who were a constitutional monarchist party that came about in 1905, they were now banned. There were also reforms to women's rights. The Bolsheviks were very strong on, they wanted an egalitarian or an equal society. And so there were many reforms to women's rights. As part of that, they made marriage a civil rather than church affair. They decriminalized homosexuality and in fact had homosexual people in government. They nationalized the banks, so there weren't any private banks. There was the decree on the abolition of estates and civil rights. Basically, being able to take, to abolish estates means to take the land of the wealthy, the bourgeoisie who had estates. They also replaced the Julian calendar with the Gregorian calendar. Now, I've made this slide too big, so bear with me while I just go back to new decrees. So on the 1st of February 1918, they changed the Julian calendar, or the old style calendar, with the new style calendar. Which, you know, hopefully that alleviates some of the confusion when we look at dates, because from now on, it will all be in new style. State capitalism. Now, the economy was collapsing when the Bolsheviks seized power. This is, as we know, due to World War I and the pressures of World War I. Food and fuel shortages were critical and production was in danger of coming to a complete halt. All of the Bolsheviks agreed that they must move forward towards a socialist economy, but there was some debate over when and how they should do that. Nikolai Bukharin argued it should happen immediately, but Lenin proposed a transitional approach that came to be known as state capitalism, and this is the approach that the Bolsheviks went with. The government would exercise tight control over key industries. They would have a monopoly on trade, i.e., they were the only ones allowed to trade. Other private corporations couldn't trade. Financial policy would be directed through a state-owned bank, but most businesses and industries would retain their old managers and bosses. So basically allowing private businesses while having control by the state. Now, Lenin argued that the expertise of bourgeois experts, such as the old managers and bosses, was necessary in this transitional phase of development from capitalism to socialism. So while Lenin was pushing for a socialist revolution and not allowing the capitalist stage of the Marxist transitional phases, now that they were in power, he was arguing that they needed to have a transitional period. While Nikolai Bukharin was much firmer in his belief that they should move immediately to a socialist economy. Some challenges for state capitalism. Workers' committees feared the collapse of production and urged the government to take ownership and regulation of more factories. They were worried that state capitalism would lead to some of the bourgeois experts, as Lenin called them, sabotaging the means of production. So the workers' committees really wanted the government to move towards a socialist economy. Many workers took control of their workplaces from the bourgeois owners without official government approval. So the Workers' Control Decree that was mentioned earlier allowed workers to take control of their workplaces. However, it needed to be approved by the government first. And in Moscow and Petrograd, for every factory formally nationalized under the Workers' Control Decree, 4 more were seized without government permission. So the workers were taking matters into their own hands. Finally, Lenin had called for a mixed economy, partly run by bourgeois specialists, but the proletariat was pushing the government away from this ideal. So their ideas were being sabotaged by workers. So that brings us to the end of this video on some of the initial challenges facing the Bolsheviks and the new regime. Our next video will look at the Constituent Assembly as well as the peace deal that Russia eventually reached with Germany. So I hope you found this helpful, and I will see you next time.